So today I'll be talking about O V Vijayan, one of the most prominent fictionists in Malayalam. You can say modern fictionists in Malayalam. He appeared on the scene in 1955 and his first story is called ഒരു യുദ്ധത്തിൻ്റെ ആരംഭം. So but when he wrote this story, he was just a modernizing writer, not a modernist. In the same mold as writers like Pongundam Varki or Keshavadev or S.K. Pattakad or similar writers who were at the forefront of what is called progressive literature, okay. Purogamana Sahityam, okay. Basically left-leaning. In fact, O V Vijayan was a card-holding member of the Communist Party when he wrote this story. So this is the first phase of O V Vijayan's literary career. Okay, but he moved on. He did not stay in the same ambit. So when he wrote a novel called Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal Idihasam, 1969, he had become a modernist. Okay, so from social realism to modernism. His first stories can be categorized as social realist. Okay, talking about social issues. Okay, ഒരു യുദ്ധത്തിൻ്റെ ആരംഭം was about a struggle of tenants in Palakkad district. Okay, their struggle against the landlord. So this movement from social realism to modernism was an important age in O V Vijayan's career. So Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal Idihasam is probably the first modernist novel in Malayalam. ആധുനിക നോവൽ, ആധുനികതയുടെ നോവൽ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്, വിത്ത് ഓൾ ദ ക്യാരക്ടറിസ്റ്റിക്സ് ഓഫ് മോഡേണിസം, fantasy, lack of direction of the characters, okay, a particular absence of any obvious social commitment, okay, a non-heroic hero, okay, Ravi, the school teacher who manned a one-teacher school. There was only one teacher in school where he taught, in a village called Kasak in Palakkad. This story is actually modeled on a real experience. His sister, O V Vijayan's sister, had taught at one such school, and the actual village was called Tasarak in Palakkad district. So O V Vijayan wrote a book on this experience. Okay, Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal Katha or some such name was given to the book, where he wrote about his writing of the novel. Okay, yeah, it's called Idihasatinte Idihasam. Yes, I remember the name, right? So this was one phase, and he continued to be a modernist after this. Several of his stories written in the 1970s mark this kind of modernism. He was also good at satire, political satire. Several of his stories are political in nature, and in fact he drew a set of cartoons which were published as a book called Ittiri Neram Bokku Ittiri Darshanam, an important cartoon series of his. Based upon the cartoons he drew for dailies, newspapers. So there also you see the typical Vijayan, okay, philosophical, humorous, okay, sometimes very funny, downright funny, you can say. So these are the characteristics of Vijayan's early writing. In 1978, he wrote a novel about the emergency of 1975-77, when Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. During this period, all civil rights were curtailed. Thousands of people were jailed. All political activity was banned. Power was concentrated in the hands of a single person in the form of the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. So, Vijayan's novel is a fantasy, okay, in which he describes a despot called Prajapati, okay, who takes all power in his hands, who creates a group of sycophants, മുഖസ്തുതിക്കാർ, രാജാവിനെ എപ്പോഴും പറ്റി എപ്പോഴും നല്ലത് പറയുന്നത്, and his ruthless dictatorship, okay, suppressing all dissent, public opinion. So this novel is yet another instance of Vijayan's what we can call political fiction. There are many such stories which are politically inclined. So this novel was called Dharma Puranam, written in serialized in 1978 and later on in 1985 published as a book. But there are other equally well-known stories, well-known fiction of Vijayan's about his anxieties, okay, as a writer, about the concentration of power in the hands of one individual or a few individuals. His anxiety, his fear of dictatorships. So there are three other stories which were written during the emergency between 1975 and 77. One is called Enna, another is called Arimpara, and a third one is called Parisha. So it is this story, third story, that we are discussing. Okay, and the other two stories are also equally important. They are published in a volume called what is it called? A slim volume of just 3 stories, published in 79. Okay, Enna, Arimpara, and Parisha. The story we are discussing. All 3 are available in translation in a book called After the Hanging, published in 1989. Yes, it's called After the Hanging. And the PDF I sent you is taken from that book which I got online. Okay, so these 3 stories. Enna is about the sale of an illicit brand of oil which made people crippled in a village. Arimpara is about a mysterious wart which grows on a man's face. It grows larger and larger. It is symbolic of the kind of concentration of power, dictatorship that was forming in India. So all these 3 stories can be related to this political horror that was unfolding in India. But before I say more about examination, let me also tell you something about Vijayan's later development as a writer. So after this phase, after he wrote Dharma Puranam, these 3 stories, Enna, Parisha, Arimpara. The other 2 stories are also available in translation. Arimpara is available as Wart, W-A-R-T. Enna is available as oil. All 3 stories, as I said, can be found in this collection called After the Hanging, published in 1989. So what did Vijayan do? Vijayan went on to write stories and novels which reflected a certain kind of what we call spirituality. Okay, he was moving on. He was no longer the communist that he was. That parting of ways had already happened in the early 70s. He had parted ways with the communist movement. He was no longer there. But now, after the 1970s, he started writing fiction which reflected a kind of spiritual perception which people have described as being very close to what we today call Hindutva. So his novels like Pravajagante Vali, Madhuram Gayadi, all these were written later on. Thalamuragal, okay, reflect this kind of spirituality, where you find a mellowed man, ആദ്യകാലത്ത് ആവേശമൊക്കെ പോയിട്ടില്ല, a man who withdraws into himself, a man who is skeptical of all political movements, liberated, even other movements, not just communism. So you find this kind of perception, this kind of let us say inclination in Vijayan. His face is turned towards this new kind of spirituality, and he uses slokas, mantras, references to Bhagavad Gita. All these things you find in these later works. Okay, even in Dharma Purana, as I said, written in 78, serialized in 78, published as a book in 1985, you find shades of this spirituality. Okay, so which we must remember was completely absent in the early stories that he wrote before Khazakinte Idihasam, from 1955 onwards, when he was a card-holding communist. Right. So what is Vijayan remarkable for? Vijayan is definitely remarkable for his language. The kind of one of the writers who actually made modern Malayalam literary language, like Bashir. You can place him next to Bashir, and of course Vijayan, the other writer who fashioned a refreshingly new idiom in Malayalam language. So that is one thing. And Vijayan's power of fantasizing, unequaled by any other writer in Malayalam, modern writer in Malayalam. All these fantasies, like the story that we are doing, Pariksha. So the kind of fantasies that Vijayan was able to create, okay, you find it early in his literary career, and his evocative language. Okay, you are carried away by the power of his narration. So a good narration, a good plot, a unique kind of language, all these are the peculiarities of O V Vijayan's fiction. Right. So when he wrote these stories, these three stories, Enna, Arimpara, Pariksha, in the period of during the emergency from 1975 to 77, we find Vijayan probably at his most powerful as a writer. Okay, so let's look at this story. What exactly is happening in this story? So this story uses the flashback technique in a very interesting way. Okay, if Venugopalan is the central character, but Venugopalan enters the story only at the end. So before that, what is happening is a plague in Palakkad district. Okay, so remember that Vijayan has changed the story a little in translation. I'll send you a clip which will help you know what exactly happened in this translation. So I'll talk about that later. Okay, but basically this story talks about a plague that happened in Palakkad district. Okay, so in this translation the year is given as 19. The exact year is not given, but it is assumed that it is somewhere in the early 40s or so. In the original story, the year was 1980, nearly a century ago. So the story centers around a character called Anandan Pilla, who was appointed to control plague in the village where it broke out in Palakkad district. So you know that rats are associated with plague. So Anandan Pilla's first job was to hunt down all rats in the neighborhood. Okay, so look at this frame, look at this plot of the story. Okay, so Anandan Pilla appears as a kind of liberative personality, somebody who saves people from a catastrophe, a calamity in the form of plague. So the story from this point onwards tells you about Anandan Pilla's growth in stature to a despot, almost a despot in the village, concentrating all people began to be afraid of him. So his rule was a kind of populist rule. Okay, so remember that this is exactly what happened during the emergency. Indira Gandhi appeared as a people-friendly ruler. Some of her measures like controlling inflation or black marketing, okay, punishing traders who exploited consumers, this made her popular in the beginning. So exactly like this, Anandan Pilla became a despot. First he hunted rats, then he assumed more powers. He went into the shop of a trader who was very close to people in power. But Anandan Pilla did not care. He found that there were black marketed items in the shop. So he confiscated them and therefore became popular in the village as a savior, ഒരു രക്ഷകനായിട്ടാണ് അദ്ദേഹം വരുന്നത്. But soon he assumed all powers in him. He prohibited sex work, all kinds of things. Okay, and not only that, he made people bow to him as a despot. Right. So appearing in the guise of a savior, okay, saving people from the plague, gradually assuming more powers to rule over them, to control, to crush all dissent. എതിരഭിപ്രായം പറയുന്നവരൊക്കെ അടിച്ചമർത്തുക. So this is the parallel of the story you'll find. So Anandan Pilla had assumed so much powers. And Anandan Pilla, that is where Vijayan's fantasy works. Like the fantasies of the Latin American writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So Anandan Pilla, the story tells us that he grew older and older. He became a permanent fixture of the village. He didn't go away. So after some time, people did not see him anymore, but they believed that he was still alive. They believed that he was living in the Palakkad fort, Tipu Sultan's fort, and he was still exercising control over the people from his hideout, not hideout, actually his secret residence in the fort. So this tells us how myths about people in power grow. Okay, you have seen some recent films probably called Thattumpuratappan, for example, about a criminal who was hiding in the attic of a house, and the young boy thought there was a god up there. Then the criminal disappeared, but people started worshipping a god called Thattumpuratappan. So such interesting things happen in our culture. So similarly, we find that sometimes people assume such stature in people's mind. They may not exist, but we believe they exist. We believe that they have supernatural powers. Okay, so this is how people look at rulers sometimes. What we call, what do we call them? Gods. Okay. Men who become, or women who become gods. Okay. Like Sai Baba or Amritanandamai, people who become gods. So they create certain myths around them, like a myth about their power, okay, their power to protect you, their power to heal you from diseases. So Anandan Pilla was such a monster. He became such a god in people's mind. So this is the flashback. So flash forward is a pure fantasy. Okay, this definitely relates to contemporary times, the emergency. Okay, so the flashback is to a distant time in the past. Flash forward. Now, in the flashback, we hear about this protagonist, Venugopalan's Muttashi, grandmother, warning him that things that are happening in the village are not for the good. ഇതൊന്നും നല്ലതിനല്ല കുട്ടിയെ എന്ന് പറയുന്നു. About Anandan Pilla and his rule. Now, Venugopalan's grandmother is long dead. He himself has become a great grandfather, and he is going out to buy things to celebrate his great grandson's birthday. When things happen, when he is accosted by a policeman whom he knows very well, but who turns to be a terrifying character, arresting him. Then a girl from a family he knows, a Nambudiri family, suddenly retorting against him, okay, and giving him a task, okay, telling him he has to take an examination. All these are bewildering fantasies, apparently meaningless. നമുക്ക് പെട്ടെന്ന് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നില്ല എന്ത് പരീക്ഷയാണ് എഴുതാൻ പറയുന്നത്, എന്തിനാണ് ഇയാളെ അറസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തത്. All these are very perplexing to us, but they make sense in the context of what I called the kind of dictatorship that arose in India. ആരെയും ഒരു കാരണവും ബോധിപ്പിക്കാതെ അറസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാം. That can be put in prison. They can be tried for crimes and punished for crimes that they did not do. So look at this link between the two. The author tells us that there is absolutely no relationship between what is narrated in the beginning, in the flashback, and what is narrated in the flash forward. He tells us plainly that you don't have to, or you can't make a link between the two. These two are entirely different things, he tells us. But we know that they are not very different. The first one, probably a historical narration of the plague in the village, mixed with fantasy, of course. Anandan Pilla cannot be a real character. Now, in this case, we clearly know that Venugopalan is living at the time of the emergency. And his predicament, what he is going through, is a nearly realistic narration. Arbitrary arrests by the police, throwing people in jail, punishment for crimes they didn't do. All these were the order of the day during the emergency. And finally, Venugopal takes an exam, he fails. Okay, so all these are very interesting, let us say, analogies and fantasies, and he is sentenced to be hanged. Okay, the story ends with his great grandson telling him that everything is dark. Yes, precisely, a statement about the condition of the country. Grandpa, everything is dark. So try to connect these two parts of the story. Okay, the first part where Anandan Pilla rules, and the second part where Venugopalan is victimized. See, so also try to read the other two stories, and you'll find out how O V Vijayan's fantasy moves on, how his fantasy becomes politically powerful, effective. Okay, so actually you should read the Malayalam also. It's available. I don't know if you have the time. It's available in the library. Okay, it's available in our library. But let me see if I can get the story for you. Okay, right. So try to get a take on Vijayan as a political satirist, as a fantasizer. Okay, I told you, nobody else in Malayalam has created such powerful fantasies, like a wart growing on your face, becoming larger than you in size. നിങ്ങളെക്കാൾ വലുതാവുന്ന ഒരു അരിമ്പാറ മുഖത്ത് വളരുന്നത്. Okay, the mysterious oil which a chettiar sells in the village, which cripples you. The myth of Anandan Pilla. So this kind of, it can be called a phantasmagoric narrative. Phantasmagoric, phantasmagoric, G-O-R-I-C, narrative. What you find in a classical writer like Kafka, author of Trial, Castle, American, who died in 1924, long before Vijayan was born. So in one sense you can call O V Vijayan's stories Kafkaesque, horrifying. When the very act of reading it creates a kind of horror in you. Okay, a kind of